So, yes, there is a problem, but it's a justice problem. It's a justice problem. It's not an Aboriginal problem. So what does that mean? It's just, it's not an Aboriginal problem. Criminalisation of Aboriginal people. If it's not about, you know, Aboriginal people being violent criminal offenders, then why are we seeing so much of an overrepresentation in the criminal justice system? How do we start to understand how there's more young people that come into contact with police, with courts, and different instances like that? Well, it's quite broad in the sense that, I say broad, but really we talk about it in our communities as the pipeline, the foster care to prison pipeline, the removal to prison pipeline, and that trajectory. So look, you can probably see what I'm writing here. I don't have the capacity to be able to take you through the last 200 years of colonization, invasion, massacre, removal, and every single sort of step of that journey that has taken our communities and families to where they are today. I mean, we have the time to touch on it, but I believe that it would be really overwhelming and take you away from the ability to try and digest why we're here today. So what I'll say is this, is there's a thread that goes alongside our communities, and that thread is trauma and healing. Now, that trauma can be direct, maybe a young person's living in a community that's you know, experiencing really complex needs. Maybe there's challenges at home, and you know, that young person has experienced childhood trauma. And that might be fact, but we know that much of that is attributed to the impact of history and the intergenerational trauma that our families have had to carry on from generation to generation. So we talk about the massacres. We talk about the forced child removal policies that were created through the Aboriginal Protection Act that were designed to take our children, to dislocate our communities, to bleed out Aboriginality, and to basically as another covert form of cultural genocide in this country. So I interviewed last week the Commissioner of First Nations Families in Victoria. She says to me, she goes, she was removed as a kid herself at 11. Now she goes, my grandmother was a domestic servant, also known as a slave. You know, we'll call it a spade a spade. She was a slave as a child, working as a domestic servant for a white family. Her father grew up more than half of his life not being recognised as human in his own country. Dealt with the challenges of navigating that, his lived experience with his mother having been through slavery, and then she gets removed as a child, being told by the government and the system that her family is no longer able to take care of her. We see these direct instances and experiences of trauma, but much of them are connected to our historical and intergenerational reality of what it means to be a blackfellow in this country. Now, that's the starting point. For 99% of Aboriginal people, that's where we are already when we start. Now, when we think about criminalisation, we think about criminal justice, we think about the system of the prison system. What we have and what we see is this life cycle of instances of intervention. What they could be as healing opportunities become triggering and traumatic experiences. So our families and communities report the challenges, for example, of oversurveillance. So let's take it back to, let's use someone's life trajectory. So they haven't even been born yet, and their parents, prenatal, pre-postnatal, are reported to experiences of oversurveillance. So what does that mean, like oversurveillance? Well, it can mean risk of significant harm reports that are being submitted by non-Aboriginal clinicians that are designed around factors that actively look to try and find risk, as opposed to actually actively looking to provide care and contribute to this heightened sense of risk and problems for Aboriginal children and families. So you get parents reporting this oversurveillance, increase in ROSH reports, and then because of that fear, because of our history of our kids being taken, we're less likely to seek pre and postnatal support because of that fear, because of the lack of cultural safety, security, strength that exists within those institutions. So we disconnect even further, and then sometimes that can go hand in hand with the risks of significant harm reporting and different things like that. So from the pre to postnatal stage, we're already operating in this trauma space, this triggering sort of pipeline we've sort of started to come in. From there, we see oversurveillance, we see young people, we see overpolicing, we know Aboriginal communities are more likely to be overpoliced. COVID lockdown, one of the highest rates for COVID fines was Walgett, which is this tiny town in far west New South Wales with an Aboriginal population of over 90%. Our communities have been notorious for being overpoliced. You have young people that are growing up in communities that are living in trauma, probably experiencing complex needs, being overpoliced, being profiled, being stereotyped. Now, if they're lucky, they'll stay with mum and dad or with auntie or uncle in community, and they'll keep a connection to community. That might keep their connection to culture and kinship strong, and they may still navigate a range of challenges growing up within that community, within communities that might be navigating complex needs, but they might be lucky as opposed to the kids that are intervention, removed, forced removal. Now, these are the kids that the system says your family aren't equipped to be able to take care of anymore, So we're going to take you, we're going to put you in foster care. Really, I'm going to imagine most of you are familiar with the stolen generation. So you know that the stolen generation came out of a policy that was made in the 60s. It was designed to take kids away. The government came out, decades later and apologized because of that policy, because of that legislation, because it was racist. It was inherently designed to disconnect families, to take away kids, and to destroy culture. The crazy thing is today, we have more kids today being removed, more Aboriginal kids being removed today from their families than we did at the height of the stolen generation. It's fucking wild. So intervention. So we started with surveillance, over surveillance and risk in a trauma space. Now we've moved into over policing, profiling, stereotyping. For the worst cases, we're seeing intervention and forced removal. Now, I'm passionate about this space because I'm a child and I'm from a family that experienced forced child removal. My sister was taken when she was 7 years old from living with my dad. They were living down at the block in Redfern, a very notorious place in Sydney. Very notorious, very significant Aboriginal community, and she was living there with my dad. My parents had really complex needs. My mum battled significant addiction and mental health, and there was little community care or resources that were there to be able to support them to stay together as a family, to support them to keep my sister with them. Late on a Friday night, the police came, banged down the door, took away my sister, and she never came home. Completely disconnected, dislocated from culture, from community, from kin. So intervention. 30% of the kids, of Aboriginal children, 30% of Aboriginal children that are forcibly removed are removed because of neglect. So what is neglect? Is there a definition of neglect? Because I can tell you, neglect is a manifestation of poverty, lack of, access to resources, food, clothing, all this sort of stuff. These are symptoms of significant poverty, not of a lack of love and a lack of care for a child or young person. So you see 30% of kids that are living in care that are there because they're poor. We see a significant number of cases where one or no reports of significant harm had been reported for a child to have been removed. And we see a number of kids that are removed that are not even living with a family or a foster family, let alone an Aboriginal family, but they're living in hotel accommodation with 24-hour caseworkers supervising them in hotel rooms. It is an absolute epidemic, and the Minister for New South Wales has made this a priority reform to recognise that the whole system needs to be dismantled and rebuilt because it is totally broken. But this all comes back to what many of our communities talk about in terms of, is this system broken, or is it doing what it was always designed to do to our people for so long? And you can't argue that that's unrealistic to talk about, because that was the whole reason Kevin Rudd apologised, was because there was a recognition that this stuff that was done was wrong, and the state took responsibility for that. So if the state's taking responsibility for that and recognise that it was wrong, then how can we still have policies and procedures and processes that exist that facilitate that? So with that journey, how is it surprising that we have this pipeline that we talk about, where kids that are removed and taken into care go from intervention and removal to detention and incarceration, where you are more likely, as a black fellow in this country, to go to prison than you are to go to university. Again, I had a podcast yarn last week with the Commissioner for First Nations Families in Canberra. She told me over 50% of the kids in custody right now, First Nations kids in custody right now in detention, were forcibly removed. We know that there's a significant correlation between being taken away from your family and ending up in the criminal justice system. We've seen it. We see it with our survivors in the stolen generation. We've seen the stories time and time again. This is the pipeline that we talk about. At every instance of intervention, the state has had two options. Is this a traumatizing experience? Is this a healing experience? Because we struggle with this concept of reconciliation between the state, the country, and Aboriginal communities. Yet at every intersection of our relationship, we have an opportunity to reconcile. We have an opportunity to close the gap, to bring our people closer together. But time and time again, we decide that this will be a traumatic intervention. Pre-postnatal surveillance and supervision will make that a traumatic experience, an intervention for families. Kids are struggling at school. Kids are maybe there's some issues around truancy. Maybe there's some behavioural issues that are manifesting as a result of complex needs at home and trauma, as opposed to looking at that from a trauma-informed, healing-centered approach to how we work with people, recognizing that there are a range of other factors that are there, and maybe we could try and support those young people. We start to bring in truant officers, or we start to bring in youth liaison officers, and roles that we talk about being designed as a way that reduce the risk or minimize the risk, and talk about it as early intervention, but really they just pathologize and normalize the reality of our children operating in these spaces. They don't become healing experiences. In fact, they just reinforce the trauma narrative and the trauma journey that our kids are going through. Intervention and forced removal. One of the most traumatic experiences of my life. I still get upset when I think about it, when I hear other stories about it, when I sit in spaces where we're navigating it together. There was a real opportunity there for the state to have looked at my family and looked at the significant issues around addiction, mental health, poverty, and thought about how can we invest resources to wrap around this family so that they have what they need to be able to care for themselves, maybe access the support that they need for their trauma, make sure these children are cared for, and to keep them together. When you think about the investment and cost that it takes to take our kids, put them in systems, put them in prisons, and all this sort of stuff, like, man, it just makes sense. Like, something isn't working. We've got to do something differently. Again, traumatic. One of the most scariest things you could do is steal a child from their family. Yeah, we do it all the time with black babies. So why, surprise, surprise, when those kids go through such a traumatic experience where they're taken, where they're booted around from foster home to foster home, if they're even lucky to get to one, some of them are just living by themselves in these hotels. I could tell you of 3 different families off the top of my head where I know children are in primary school living in hotels with 24-hour casework supervision. Why are we surprised that that leads It's incarceration. So this is what we talk about when we talk about the pipeline to prison, the foster care to prison pipeline. It's a trajectory for us as blackfellas before we are even born, in terms of how we are pathologized, how we are profiled, how our families are targeted, how the system is taught to seek out risk as opposed to seeking out support, or or seeking out strength, and how that continues to manifest over the journey of our young people's lives that increases our risk of incarceration today. So if you take away anything from this sort of brief oversight into how we think about the pipeline paradigm, is that every instance of engagement with the system has two choices. Is this a traumatic experience? Is this a healing experience? There's many different ways we can unpack that, but it's an important question as a practitioner, as a policy developer, and as a person, whenever you're doing work in this sort of space with our people, that you're asking yourself those questions. Hopefully this is valuable. And if you've got any questions, please reach out. I'm happy to have a yarn. And yeah, let me know if you want to understand this stuff in more detail. All right, thanks.